put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The weight of nothing. A country doesn't collapse in a day. It's dismantled, piece by hands you're told to trust. Venezuela, a nation floating on an ocean of oil, the largest proven reserves on Earth, should have been untouchable. Prosperous, wealthy beyond measure. Instead, its citizens began weighing their money by the kilogram just to buy bread. Inflation didn't just rise, it exploded into the millions of percent, turning banknotes into wallpaper and life savings into dust. This isn't a story about economic theory or failed policy. This is a story about a heist so massive, so systematic, that an entire nation became the victim. And the thieves? They wore suits, held office, and smiled for cameras, while the vault door swung wide open behind them. In the late 1990s, Venezuela stood at a crossroads. The nation possessed wealth that should have guaranteed generations of prosperity. Oil reserves larger than Saudi Arabia's, natural resources beyond calculation, and a population hungry for change. When Hugo Chavez swept into power in 1999, promising revolution and redistribution, millions believed salvation had arrived. He spoke the language of the poor, condemned the elite, and pledged to build a socialist paradise funded by black gold pumping from beneath Venezuelan soil. But revolution, as it turns out, makes an excellent cover story for the greatest corporate scandal a government has ever orchestrated. What followed wasn't socialism, it was a masterclass in state-sponsored theft disguised as ideology. The mechanism was elegant in its brutality: nationalization. Chavez systematically seized control of Venezuela's oil industry, placing the state-owned company PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, under direct government authority. He fired thousands of experienced workers and replaced them with political loyalists who understood allegiance better than engineering. On paper, this concentration of power would fund social programs and uplift the masses. In reality, it created the perfect conditions for embezzlement on a scale that would make Wall Street criminals look like petty shoplifters. PDVSA became a shadow bank, a money laundering operation masquerading as a national oil company. Contracts were awarded not to the most qualified bidders, but to shell companies owned by regime insiders. Oil revenues that should have flowed into national coffers vanished into offshore accounts in Switzerland, Andorra, and the Caribbean. The Venezuelan people were told their oil wealth was being redistributed to them. They never saw it. Officials did. But stealing oil money was just the foundation. The real business scandal, the dark machinery that would eventually destroy an entire economy, required something more sophisticated: currency manipulation. The Venezuelan government implemented strict currency controls, creating a Byzantine system of multiple exchange rates that only the connected could navigate. The official exchange rate bore no relationship to reality. If you had government connections, you could buy US dollars at the official rate, absurdly cheap, and immediately sell them on the black market for 10, 20, sometimes 50 times more. This wasn't a loophole. It was a feature, a wealth transfer mechanism designed to enrich those with access while impoverishing everyone else. Regime-connected businessmen would request dollars for importing essential goods, receive them at government rates, then either pocket the difference or never import anything at all. The scheme had a name: Cadivi. It became Venezuela's largest theft engine, generating billions in illicit profits, while ordinary citizens watched their purchasing power evaporate. The mathematics of destruction were simple: print money to fund government spending, steal oil revenues, manipulate exchange rates, watch as inflation begins its deadly climb. By 2012, inflation had reached 20% annually, troubling but manageable, By 2014, it hit 69%. Then oil prices collapsed. Venezuela's government had built its entire financial structure on the assumption that oil would stay expensive forever. When prices plummeted from over $100 per barrel to below $30, the theft became obvious. There was nothing left to steal. The regime's response revealed its true nature. Print more money, maintain the lie, accelerate the looting. They weren't trying to fix anything. They were trying to grab whatever remained before the whole structure collapsed. And then came the acceleration, the moment when theft transformed into economic apocalypse. In 2016, inflation hit 800%. The International Monetary Fund stopped publishing Venezuela's inflation data because the numbers were too unreliable. The government had stopped providing real statistics. But independent economists kept counting. 2017, 2.616% inflation. 2018, 130,060%. 2019, 9,585,502%. Read that number again. Nearly 10 million% inflation in a single year. Money became worthless faster than it could be printed. A bolivar breakfast in January might cost 10 million bolivars by December. Venezuelans stopped counting money and started weighing it. Stacks of bills to buy a single egg. Children's toys made from discarded banknotes because paper was cheaper than bolivars. This wasn't hyperinflation. This was financial annihilation. But here's what makes this business scandal truly dark. Someone was still profiting. While ordinary Venezuelans starved, regime-connected businessmen known as boliburgueses, the Bolivarian bourgeoisie, accumulated vast fortunes. They understood the game. Get dollars at official rates, import goods at subsidized prices, sell them for whatever the collapsing currency could bear. Or better yet, don't import anything at all. Just take the dollars and run. Names emerged from the shadows. Alejandro Betancourt, an oil and gas magnate, allegedly siphoned $4.5 billion from PDVSA through fraudulent contracts and currency schemes. Raúl Gorin, a television mogul, reportedly obtained $2.4 billion in fraudulent currency allocations. These weren't street criminals. These were government-connected entrepreneurs who transformed state collapse into personal wealth. U.S. prosecutors would eventually indict over 50 individuals in connection with Venezuelan corruption schemes. But by then, billions had already disappeared into the global financial system. The human cost defies comprehension. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Surgery patients were turned away because there was no anesthesia. Diabetics died because insulin became unavailable. Supermarket shelves stood empty while government-connected importers hoarded food to drive up prices. Venezuelans lost an average of 24 pounds in 2017, not from dieting, from starvation. This became known as the Maduro diet, named for Nicolas Maduro, who inherited Chávez's presidency in 2013 and continued the systematic looting with even less pretense. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled their country, one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. Born not from war, but from economic warfare, waged by leaders against their own people. The oil industry, the source of Venezuela's wealth, became a graveyard of corruption. PDVSA's production collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in the late 1990s to barely 400,000 by 2020. Equipment wasn't maintained because maintenance contracts went to shell companies that never did the work. Engineers fled the country. Refineries crumbled. Oil facilities leaked and exploded with increasing frequency, killing workers and destroying infrastructure. Venezuela, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, began importing gasoline because it could no longer refine its own crude. Lines at gas stations stretched for days. Fuel became so scarce that people abandoned their cars on highways and walked home. This wasn't incompetence. Incompetence doesn't steal $300 billion. This was calculated extraction, disguised as revolutionary governance. But the true genius of the scheme, the darkest innovation in this business scandal, was how they made the crime invisible. Maduro's government began issuing new currency denominations so frequently that cash registers couldn't keep up. The 100 Bolivar note, once Venezuela's largest, became worthless. The government introduced 500 Bolivar notes, then 1,000, then 5,000, then 10,000. Eventually, they released a 1 million Bolivar note, and it wasn't enough to buy a loaf of bread. In 2018, the government enacted a monetary reconversion, slashing 5 zeros from the currency. The old Bolivar became the Bolivar Soberano, the sovereign Bolivar. It failed within months. In 2021, they did it again, removing 6 more zeros and creating the Bolivar Digital. 11 zeros removed in 3 years. Every reconversion was marketed as a solution, a fresh start, a return to stability. In reality, each reconversion was an admission, a public acknowledgement that the previous currency had been destroyed, and the new one would be too. It was monetary theater designed to make people forget how much had been stolen. The international dimension of this theft reveals how deeply corruption can burrow into global systems. Venezuelan officials didn't just steal money, they laundered it through the world's most prestigious financial institutions. Swiss banks, Portuguese real estate, Miami penthouses, Spanish construction companies, Caribbean shell corporations. The corruption network operated across continents, facilitated by complicit bankers, lawyers, and businessmen who asked no questions as long as the fees kept flowing. One particularly egregious scheme involved PDVSA bonds. The Venezuelan government issued bonds at deep discounts through intermediary companies, who then resold them at market rates, pocketing the difference. Goldman Sachs purchased $2.8 billion in Venezuelan bonds in 2017, a deal that provided the Maduro regime with desperately needed cash while the population starved. The outcry was fierce, but the money had already changed hands. This is how modern financial crime works. Legitimacy purchased through institutional participation. Behind every hyperinflationary collapse lies a simple truth. Someone chose this. Inflation doesn't appear spontaneously. It's manufactured through specific decisions, printing money without economic backing, refusing to adjust failed policies, prioritizing short-term political survival over long-term stability. Chavez and Maduro could have stopped the spiral at any point. They could have reduced government spending, stopped printing money, eliminated corruption, diversified the economy, allowed market reforms. They chose not to, because reform would have meant transparency. Transparency would have meant accountability. Accountability would have meant prison. So they maintained the system, blamed external enemies, the United States, capitalism, imperialism, and continued looting while the nation burned. Every authoritarian who has ever destroyed a currency tells the same lie. The enemy is outside our borders. The truth is always the same. The enemy is in the palace. The psychological manipulation required to sustain such a scheme is staggering. Maduro appeared on television demonstrating how to make prosperity arepas, traditional corn cakes, using government-subsidized flour that didn't exist in stores. He handed out certificates for millionaire bonuses, payments that were worthless before recipients could spend them. He created the petro, supposedly a cryptocurrency backed by oil reserves, which became one of the world's most obvious scams. A digital currency with no blockchain, no transparency, and no value, except as another mechanism for regime insiders to move money. The government blamed everything on economic warfare, claiming sanctions and sabotage destroyed the economy. But the timeline tells a different story. Venezuela's inflation was already in triple digits before major sanctions took effect. The hyperinflation wasn't caused by external pressure. It was caused by internal theft. Sanctions made things worse, certainly, but they didn't cause the collapse. The collapse was engineered, refined, perfected by those in power. Perhaps the darkest lesson in this business scandal is how predictable it all was. Economists warned for years that Venezuela's policies would lead to hyperinflation. Opposition figures documented the corruption in real time. Whistleblowers inside PDVSA risked their lives to expose the theft. None of it mattered, because when the people running a country are also the ones stealing from it, warnings become irrelevant. Venezuela's hyperinflation followed the same pattern as every hyperinflationary episode in history. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Hungary. Massive money printing to cover government deficits, loss of currency confidence, price spirals, economic collapse. The playbook for disaster was already written. Venezuelan leaders simply chose to follow it. Why? Because in the short term, before total collapse, those in control become spectacularly wealthy. They're not stupid. They're rational actors maximizing personal gain within a system they've rigged. The tragedy is that millions pay the price for dozens' enrichment. Today, Venezuela remains in crisis. The economy has stabilized somewhat, not because leadership improved, but because there's almost nothing left to steal, and the currency has been effectively abandoned for US dollars in most transactions. Maduro remains in power, insulated by security forces and allied nations who benefit from Venezuela's remaining resources. Many of the businessmen who profited from the schemes live comfortably in exile, their wealth laundered and legitimized through real estate and investments. Some have been indicted by US authorities, but indictments without arrests are just paperwork. The Venezuelan people, meanwhile, continue to suffer the consequences of decisions made in boardrooms and palaces years ago. Their life savings, gone. Their pensions, worthless. Their futures, stolen. This is what unchecked power does when combined with systematic greed. It doesn't just destroy wealth, it destroys trust, hope, and the basic social contract that holds nations together. The business lessons buried in Venezuela's nightmare are sobering. First, concentration of power without accountability always leads to corruption, whether in governments or corporations. When one entity controls critical resources with no oversight, theft becomes inevitable. Second, currency manipulation and artificial exchange rates create arbitrage opportunities that benefit insiders at everyone else's expense. Venezuela's Cadivi scheme was essentially insider trading at a national scale. Third, short-term thinking destroys long-term value. Every dollar stolen from PDVSA was a dollar not invested in maintenance, innovation, or sustainability. The regime traded Venezuela's future for immediate personal enrichment. Fourth, when leadership's incentives diverge from an organization's health, collapse becomes a matter of time. If executives profit more from destroying a company than building it, destruction is what you'll get. Venezuela's leaders had no incentive to fix the economy because dysfunction enabled their wealth extraction. And finally, the most chilling lesson: this can happen anywhere. Venezuela wasn't always a failed state. It was once the richest country in South America, with a thriving middle class and democratic institutions. The descent from prosperity to hyperinflation took less than 2 decades. All it required was leaders willing to prioritize power over principle, insiders willing to profit from systemic theft, and enough institutional decay that no one could stop them. The mechanisms that destroyed Venezuela exist everywhere: currency manipulation, regulatory capture, crony capitalism, the revolving door between government and industry. What separates functional economies from failed ones isn't the absence of these mechanisms, but the strength of institutions, that prevent their abuse. When those guardrails fail, when transparency disappears, when leaders can operate without consequence, the spiral begins, and once it starts, it accelerates. A country doesn't collapse in a day. It's dismantled piece by hands you're told to trust. Venezuela's hyperinflation wasn't a natural disaster or an inevitable economic cycle. It was a heist, the largest, most devastating corporate scandal ever perpetrated against an entire nation. The perpetrators wore suits, held office, and smiled for cameras while they methodically looted the vault until nothing remained but empty promises and worthless paper. The fortune they stole, estimated at over $300 billion, could have built hospitals, schools, infrastructure, and prosperity for generations. Instead, it sits in offshore accounts, Miami real estate, and Swiss banks, while Venezuelan children dig through garbage for food. This is the dark side of business at its most ruthless. When an entire country becomes the mark, when a nation's wealth becomes the score, and when the criminals are the ones holding the keys to the vault. They didn't just steal Venezuela's money, they stole its future, and they're still counting their profits while the nation weighs its worthless currency by the kilogram, trying to remember when money meant something more than the weight of betrayal. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.